What happens when the family you thought you knew hides a secret that could shatter everything? Madison Reeves was pushed to the shadows, treated like she didn't belong, while her mother's legacy was stolen right under her nose. But the truth has a way of coming out, and when it does, no one is safe from the fallout. Join us as we uncover a gripping tale of betrayal, hidden identities, and a woman's fierce fight to reclaim her life and justice. This is a story about what it truly means to find your place, even when the ones who should protect you turn against you. The rain in Burlington had a way of making even the most pristine homes look haunted. Drops streaked down the towering windows of the Carter estate, distorting the view like the tears Madison once cried behind those same panes. It had been 13 years, but the echo of that night, the screams, the slamming doors, the words no child should ever hear, still pulsed in her bones. Now, parked across the street in a rented Ford Fusion, Madison Carter watched as lights flickered on inside the mansion that no longer bore her name. Her reflection in the rearview mirror barely resembled the girl who once called that place home. Gone were the messy curls and hopeful eyes. What stared back at her now was precision. Shoulder-length, chestnut hair, pressed collar, and a guarded stare honed by years of survival. She hadn't planned to return. Not really. But when the email came last week, unsigned and from a disposable account, it stirred something too deep to ignore. You were right to leave. But he's dying now, and they're rewriting the will. No name, no attachments. Just those 13 words. And now she was here. Inside the estate, Donald Carter's empire remained intact. Or so it appeared. Madison knew the truth was never in the granite countertops or the family portraits. It was buried in sealed envelopes, hushed phone calls, and looks exchanged across 2 perfect dinner tables. A flash of movement near the window drew her attention. It was Amber. Still impossibly poised, still wearing mother's pearls as if they were earned. Madison clenched her jaw. Amber had been the golden child, the heir apparent, even though Madison was the eldest by 3 years. But Amber had charm, manipulation disguised as sweetness. She had also been the one to whisper to their father that Madison wasn't right, that her birth certificate didn't match the family records, that perhaps someone should check the hospital logs. The damage had been swift. The questions, the accusations, the silence, and finally, the sentence. "You're not one of us. Leave." That night, Madison had walked out with nothing but a duffel bag and a hollowed-out heart. She survived on scholarships, odd jobs, and an unshakable resolve. She didn't just escape, she rebuilt. And now, she wasn't here to beg for a place at their table. She was here to flip the whole table over. She reached into the glove compartment and pulled out the letters she'd found in her mother's old belongings. One she hadn't opened until last month. The handwriting was unmistakably her mother's. The return address was from a private clinic in upstate New York. Madison, if you're reading this, it means they finally got what they wanted. My silence. But the truth is bigger than their lies. You were never the mistake. You were the reason they feared exposure. She hadn't slept the night she read that. Nor the next. For all the coldness her mother had shown in public, this letter cracked the shell. Confessions of betrayal, coercion, and a hidden truth about Madison's parentage that threatened the entire Carter legacy. Tonight wasn't just a homecoming. It was the beginning of the reckoning. She stepped out of the car, rain soaking through her coat, but she didn't flinch. The stone lion statues at the estate's gate still stood guard like before, unchanged sentinels of a lie. As she approached, she saw Gloria, the housekeeper, now grayer but still swift in her movements, placing a flower arrangement in the foyer. Madison paused. Would Gloria recognize her? Would anyone? Then again, it didn't matter. Recognition wasn't the goal. Retribution was. Madison rang the bell and took one step back, steadying her breath. The iron door, larger than she remembered, opened with a soft mechanical click, and there she was. Patricia. still elegant, still terrifying in her restraint. The woman blinked twice, confusion flooding her manicured face, before it froze into something colder than shock. Calculation. "Madison?" Her voice was calm, too calm. "I didn't know you were invited." Madison tilted her head. "You always did confuse invited with allowed." There was a beat of silence, thick and sticky like molasses. Patricia stepped aside without another word. Madison entered. The scent hit her first. Lemongrass polish, old wood, and something antiseptic, like a hospital trying to hide its decay. The hallway was still lined with family portraits, every one of them a masterpiece of illusion. Donald's stern but noble face, Ember's dazzling smile. Even Tyler's high school football photo was there, frozen in his brief moment of unearned glory. Madison's image was nowhere. Her existence had been erased with ruthless efficiency. "Your father's not well," Patricia said, walking ahead. "But I'm sure you already know that. Why else would you show up now?" Madison didn't respond, not yet. They passed the study. The door was ajar. For a moment, Madison saw someone sitting inside. Amber. Legs crossed, wine in hand, phone glowing, still basking in her own reflection. She didn't look up good. Madison wasn't ready for that face yet. Patricia led her to the West Wing, a part of the house rarely used when Madison still lived there. It had since been converted into a sick room, flat screens, medical monitors, sterile air. And lying beneath it all, like a relic of some ancient regime, was Donald Carter. He looked smaller now. Not physically, he still had his broad frame, but the aura had shriveled. The man who once stood tall at shareholder meetings, who dismissed his own daughter with a signature, now lay beneath cashmere blankets and oxygen tubes. His eyes opened slowly. At first, there was no recognition. Then, a flicker. "Madison," he croaked, dry and unsure. She nodded once, not moving closer. "I wasn't expecting you," he said. "I'm sure," she replied. He coughed. Patricia moved to adjust his pillow, but Madison stepped forward and gently blocked her. "I'll take it from here." Patricia's eyebrows lifted, but she didn't argue. She left, heels clicking like gunshots. When the door shut, silence wrapped around them. "You shouldn't have come back," Donald said after a moment. "It's too late." "No," Madison said softly. "It's finally the right time." She reached into her coat and pulled out a sealed envelope, crisp, marked by the same handwriting from her mother's final letter. She laid it on the table beside his IV stand. "What's that?" "A reminder," she said. "Of what you did? Of what you let happen?" He stared at it like it might detonate. "I know you changed the will," she continued, "and I know why." His face twitched. "Barely. Amber told you?" "No, she doesn't know." "I'm 2 steps ahead." Outside the window, the rain had slowed to a mist, the kind of quiet weather that lured people into thinking storms were done. Madison knew better. "I'm not here for money," she added. "I'm here for the truth, for everything you buried. I'll find it, and when I do, no one will be able to pretend anymore." He said nothing, but she saw it in his eyes, the shift. A man who once held power over her, now afraid of the one thing she carried that he couldn't control, the truth. She turned and walked out of the room without another word. As she passed the staircase, she heard Amber laughing from the parlor, but it wasn't joy. It was strategy. At the base of the stairs, someone brushed past her. "Gloria." The old housekeeper slipped a folded paper into Madison's hand without meeting her eyes. Madison waited until she reached the driveway before unfolding it. A name, a date, and one sentence scrawled in messy, panicked ink. "She's not who you think she is." Madison's fingers tightened around the page. Let the games begin. The diner hadn't changed. Same dusty blinds half drawn, same torn vinyl booths. same scent of burnt coffee and bacon grease that clung to your clothes for hours after. Madison slid into the back corner booth, the one that used to be hers on Sunday mornings. Before everything splintered, Ross from her, Zoe McMillan stirred her iced tea, the spoon clinking against the glass like a ticking clock. "I almost didn't recognize you," Zoe said after a long pause. "Last I heard you were in Boston, working some tech startup?" "Still am," Madison replied. "Took a leave, family matters." Zoe raised an eyebrow. "That's new. You used to say you didn't have a family." Madison gave her a small smile. "Technically, I still don't." Zoe studied her for a moment, her gaze sharper than it used to be. Life had shaped her into someone practical, nails clipped short, hair pulled back, no patience for small talk. They hadn't spoken in years. Not since the night Madison left Burlington without so much as a goodbye. But now, she needed her. Zoe was one of the few who had seen behind the Carter family's polished facade. "Why now?" Zoe asked, finally. Madison reached into her bag and pulled out the folded note Gloria had slipped her the night before. She laid it flat between them. Zoe scanned the page, then froze. "I know that name," she whispered. "I thought you might." Zoe's eyes flicked up. "That woman, she used to come into the ER when I was doing triage. Always bruised, gave fake names. I remember thinking there was something off about her, but no one looked twice. Until one night, she just stopped showing up." "Do you think she's connected to Patricia?" Madison asked. "I think she's connected to all of them." Zoe's tone dropped. "And if that name's coming up now, it means someone's trying to tie up loose ends." Madison felt the cold seep into her spine. She had come back for the truth. But truth, she was learning, rarely came alone. It dragged ghosts with it. Zoe slid the paper back. "You really want to do this?" "I have to," Madison said. "They stole everything. My name, my mother's memory, my right to exist. I can't walk away this time." Zoe didn't respond immediately. She glanced around the diner, 3 tables occupied, the waitress refilling ketchup bottles, and then leaned in. "Okay, then we start with this woman. I'll check the old hospital records, see if any of the aliases match up with addresses." "You?" "I'm going back to the source," Madison said. "My mother's old things. I found a key last night, a small one. Looks like it's for a file cabinet or safety box. She used to hide things in the attic before Patricia moved in and had it cleaned out." Zoe's brow furrowed. "You think your mother knew what was coming?" "I think she knew something, and that she tried to warn me." The waitress came by with the check. Madison paid in cash. As they stood, Zoe reached out and placed a hand on Madison's arm. "Don't do this alone." Madison met her eyes. "I'm not." Outside, the sky was that dull Vermont gray, flat and endless. Madison pulled her coat tight and stepped into the wind. She didn't notice the dark SUV across the street until she saw its reflection in the glass of the diner door. It wasn't parked there earlier. Someone was watching. And they didn't want her digging. The attic was colder than she remembered. Dust coated every surface like ash after a fire. Madison pulled the string hanging from the bare bulb and squinted against the harsh light. The wooden floor groaned beneath her as she stepped deeper into the cramped space. A few boxes remained stacked in the far corner, ones Patricia hadn't bothered to throw out, or perhaps hadn't dared to open. She knelt beside the nearest one. The label was faded but legible. Eleanor, personal. Her mother's handwriting. Inside were old photo albums, a few yellowed letters, a lace scarf that still smelled faintly of lavender. Madison ran her fingers over the edge of a manila envelope tucked at the bottom. Her pulse quickened. It wasn't sealed. Inside, she found an aged hospital ID badge with the name Margaret Elkins, but the photo was of Eleanor. Her mother had used an alias. Madison sat back on her heels, heart pounding. Why would her mother need a fake name? She sifted through the envelope again and found a small key taped to the inside flap, matching the one she'd discovered in her jewelry box. Her fingers trembled as she slipped it into the rusted lock of the nearby metal cabinet. Click. The door creaked open, revealing several neatly labeled files. One read, Raymond Carter, 1989-1992. Another, Patricia L., Correspondence Confidentially. Madison's breath caught as she flipped open the first one. It wasn't just bank statements or tax records. There were letters, diary excerpts, even photographs. Her mother had documented everything. Not just Eleanor's suspicions, but evidence. A photo fluttered out. Raymond standing beside a woman who wasn't Eleanor, a hand on her waist, smiling, intimate. Scrawled on the back, Baltimore, October 1991. The timeline clicked in Madison's mind. That was months before her mother's accident. Months before Patricia moved in. Madison heard a creak below. She froze. The house was supposed to be empty. She carefully set the file aside and stepped toward the attic ladder, listening. Another creak, closer this time. Her heart raced. She silently pulled out her phone, thumb hovering over Zoe's number. And then a voice, soft, amused, drifted up the stairs. Still snooping, Madison? Patricia. Madison's spine stiffened. Didn't you ever learn? Some boxes are locked for a reason. Madison stepped into the light of the attic opening, holding a folder in one hand like a weapon, and some locks were meant to be broken. Patricia stood at the bottom of the ladder, arms crossed, not even pretending to be surprised. Funny. I thought you'd come crawling back for money, but you want something else, don't you? You always did crave attention. I want the truth, Madison said. Not the version you fed my father, or the one you whispered behind closed doors. Patricia laughed. Your father's dead, and no one cares about the truth, dear. They care about the story that's easiest to swallow. And yours? Well, you never learned to shut up. I won't shut up anymore. Their eyes locked in silence. Patricia stepped back into the shadows. You're opening a door you can't close, Madison. Be careful what you dig up. Some graves aren't empty. She disappeared down the hall. Madison's legs felt like water as she climbed down, folder pressed to her chest. Outside, she locked the house behind her, chest heaving in the crisp air. Her breath fogged the window as she looked back. She hadn't just stirred the past, she had woken it, and someone, Patricia maybe more, was ready to bury her with it. The courtroom air was sterile, humming with fluorescent lights and unspoken tension. Madison sat at the plaintiff's table, her palms resting flat against the smooth wood, the folder from the attic securely in her briefcase by her feet. Zoe sat beside her, face composed but eyes flickering between the judge's bench and the door at the back of the chamber. They weren't here for the real fight, yet. Today was procedural, an evidentiary hearing for the civil case concerning Eleanor's contested will. But for Madison, it was a battlefield dressed in beige carpet and mahogany trim, a public step into the storm she had spent years preparing for. Across the aisle sat Patricia, wearing a muted navy suit that almost passed for humility. Her lawyer, Douglas Penner, an aging man with too much charm and too little conscience, whispered something in her ear. She smiled, like she had already won. Judge Harmon entered, adjusted his glasses, and called the hearing to order. Madison stood. Her voice, clear but measured, filled the room. Your Honor, I would like to submit new evidence pertaining to the suppression of the original will signed by my mother, Eleanor Carter, dated May 14, 1992. This includes documentation of coercion, falsification, and post-mortem tampering, as well as newly recovered personal records. She felt Patricia's eyes drill into her, but she didn't flinch. Judge Harmon nodded. Submit the materials to the court clerk. A formal review will be scheduled. The clerk approached, and Madison handed over the envelope with fingers she forced to stay steady. The moment it left her hand, she felt both lighter and more exposed. When the hearing adjourned, Reporters were waiting. Cameras flashed as Madison exited the courthouse steps. A voice shouted, "Mr. Carter, are you saying your stepmother forged your mother's will?" Zoe moved to block them, but Madison raised her hand gently and turned to the nearest mic. "I'm saying my mother's voice was silenced once. They won't let it happen again." That night, the news spread fast. Local headlines lit up. Heiress files motion to reopen Carter estate. Old wounds, new evidence, and family feud or fraud. Madison sat on the edge of her hotel bed, remote in one hand, the TV glowing with talking heads dissecting her family legacy. She flipped it off. The silence that followed was deeper than any crowd's roar. She picked up her phone and opened the email Zoe had forwarded earlier, a digital scan of a typed letter found in the files. It had no signature, but the phrasing was unmistakably Eleanor's voice. "If anything happens to me, it wasn't an accident. I fear Patricia has gotten too close. There are things I should have said, things I should have done, but I fear the window is closing." Madison reread the lines over and over. Her mother hadn't been paranoid. She had been preparing for war and never got the chance to fight it. A knock on the door jolted her. It was late, past 10. She approached cautiously. Through the peephole, a woman, older, pale, wearing a faded cardigan and clutching a worn leather purse. Madison cracked the door. "Yes?" The woman's voice trembled. "My name is Gloria Whitman. I used to work for your family. I took care of you when you were small. Before the accident." The air turned heavy. Madison opened the door wider. "Come in." Gloria stepped in slowly, eyes sweeping the room like memories were layered on every surface. "I saw you on the news," she said, sitting down gingerly. "I thought maybe it was time." "Time for what?" She opened her purse. Inside was a small cloth-bound notebook, stained at the edges. "I kept notes, things I wasn't supposed to see, things your mother told me in whispers. I think you're finally ready to know what she was so afraid of." Madison's fingers closed around the notebook before she could think. The war had just widened. The pages were delicate. The ink faded with time. Madison sat at the table across from Gloria, a mug of untouched chamomile tea warming her palm as her eyes scanned the notebook. Each entry was dated in Eleanor's unmistakable cursive, some just fragments of overheard conversations, others more deliberate, more desperate. April 3rd. "Patricia asked me again about changing the will. Her tone, it wasn't suggestion, it was warning." May 10th. "Tyler's behavior with the books is off. Someone is hiding assets under Madison's name. I won't let them do this to her." June 1st. "I told Gloria to take Madison out of the house if anything ever felt wrong. She promised she would." Madison looked up, her throat thick. "You knew something was wrong even then?" Gloria nodded. "Your mother was smart, but she was scared. Patricia had her cornered. Your father, Donald, had already started to retreat into silence, and when your mother died, Patricia made sure no one could ask questions." Madison's mind spun. She remembered the day of Eleanor's funeral clearly. Patricia's tight black dress, her cold fingers on Madison's shoulder, the way Tyler, barely 20 then, had already started calling Patricia Mom in front of everyone. "What about the fire?" Madison asked suddenly. "The study? Wasn't that where the safe was kept?" Gloria's gaze dropped. "That wasn't an accident." Madison stared at her. "You're saying Patricia set that fire?" Lying, saying, "The fire started the day after Eleanor told me she planned to show you everything. Her real will, the trust papers, even the sealed envelope with your adoption truth. She said she couldn't keep hiding the fact that," Gloria's voice faltered, "that what? That you weren't Donald's daughter." The words didn't land all at once. They hovered in the air, waiting to be absorbed. Madison's chest tightened. "Then who?" Gloria pulled something else from her purse. A photograph. Madison's mother, younger, standing with a man Madison didn't recognize, handsome, sharply dressed, and unmistakably familiar in the shape of the jawline. One Madison saw every morning in the mirror. His name was Ethan Rowe. Your mother knew him long before she met Donald. He was a lawyer, worked with her at the Carter Foundation. They were in love, but when Donald proposed, the family pressured her to accept. The Carters didn't think Ethan was established enough. Madison felt the world shifting under her feet. I thought I was adopted. You were, technically. Donald adopted you to erase any trace of Ethan. They forged the papers. He paid off the doctor, but Eleanor wrote the truth in letters, in this journal, and in that envelope that went missing after she died. Madison stood and began to pace. Her whole life had been built on controlled narratives, orchestrated silences. She had been loyal to a name that wasn't even hers by blood. Zoe returned to the suite, pausing at the sight of Gloria. She knows, Madison said quietly. Everything, or at least more than we ever did. Zoe raised a brow, then closed the door softly behind her. Gloria reached into her purse one final time and slid over a yellowed envelope. This was given to me by Eleanor the week before she died. She told me never to show it unless you came back for the truth. Madison opened it with trembling hands. Inside was a single-page letter, handwritten by Eleanor. There was no greeting, just a final message. Don't let them rewrite you, Madison. Your name, your story, your soul. They belong to you. I was a coward for too long. Don't be like me. Be loud, be seen. Outside, a storm was starting to swell over the city. Madison stood at the window, watching the clouds roll in, her reflection fractured by raindrops on the glass. The past had spoken, and she was done whispering. The air inside the Carter estate was staler than Madison remembered, though the furnishings had changed, sleeker, colder, more curated for appearances. The undercurrent of tension was achingly familiar. She could still feel the ghost of herself walking barefoot on that marble floor, ignored by voices that passed above her head like weather. Tyler stood by the fireplace, swirling a glass of bourbon like it held answers. Patricia sat across from him, perfectly composed in an ivory cashmere sweater and pearl earrings, the image of practiced grace. Madison stepped into the room like an unwanted echo. "Well," Patricia said without turning, "look what the storm dragged in." Tyler's jaw tensed. "You weren't invited." "I wasn't asking," Madison replied, her voice sharper than she intended. There was a pause. Only the soft ticking of the grandfather clock broke the silence. "I'm here about the trust," Madison continued, "and my mother's will, the original one, the one you never filed." Patricia turned then, slowly. "That's a bold accusation." "I have the journal," Madison said. "I have names. I have letters in her handwriting. And I'm not the scared little girl you used to shut out." Tyler scoffed. "You think a few scribbles in a diary mean anything in court? I think Eleanor Carter's words carry more weight than yours ever will." Patricia rose from her chair, smoothing invisible wrinkles from her skirt. "Let me be very clear. You were taken in, fed, clothed, given a name, a future. And this is how you repay us?" "Repay?" Madison took a step forward. "You mean by disappearing quietly so your son could take what wasn't his, or staying silent so you could parade around with your fake grief and keep the Carter Foundation under your thumb?" Patricia's eyes narrowed. "You sound just like her." "Good," Madison said. "She was the only decent one among you." Tyler threw his glass into the fireplace. The crash echoed, sharp and final. "You think this is going to end well for you?" he spat. "You have no idea what you're walking into." "I'm not walking," Madison replied, calmed now. "I'm taking back what was stolen." She turned on her heel and left, her heels striking the floor like a metronome of reckoning. Later that night, Madison sat in her car outside the downtown legal office of Hawthorne and Fields. The neon sign flickered over the rain-slick pavement. Zoe was beside her, fingers fidgeting with the zipper on her sleeve. "You sure about this?" Zoe asked. "Going through with it? The petition to reopen the trust?" Madison nodded. "I've waited 12 years. I won't wait 12 more." Inside, a young paralegal led them to a private conference room. The walls were lined with framed law school degrees and photos of courtroom victories. Across the table sat Raymond Ellis, her mother's former attorney. He looked older than she remembered, softer, but his eyes still held steel. "I wasn't sure you'd come," he said, sliding a thick file toward her. "Your mother asked me to prepare this in the event that you returned with proof. Letters, DNA confirmation, handwriting samples. Looks like you've done your homework." "She did most of it," Madison said quietly. "We're just finishing what she started." Raymond opened the file and pulled out a document. "This is her final addendum to the will, dated 1 month before she died. She changed the beneficiaries, removed Tyler, gave full guardianship of the Carter Foundation to you." Madison's breath caught. Why wasn't it filed? Raymond hesitated. "Because it went missing the night she died. I found it again 3 years ago in an anonymous envelope. I waited for you." Zoe stared at the document like it was radioactive. "What if Patricia finds out?" Madison didn't flinch. "Let her. I want her to see every signature, every line, every dollar she never earned." Raymond slid the papers across the table. "Then let's begin." Madison picked up the pen. The ink flowed fast, like a current pulling her into a future she was finally ready to face. The news broke 2 days later. A small but pointed article in the Burlington Ledger ran under the unassuming headline, "Disputed Will Surfaces in Carter Foundation Case," buried in the business section, but placed just high enough to make waves in the right circles. Madison didn't need it to go viral. She needed it to sting the people who still pretended her mother's voice had vanished with her death. By mid-morning, her inbox was flooded with vague apologies and sudden invitations. Former board members, distant cousins, aunts who had once laughed behind closed doors at her awkward silence. They all wanted to reconnect, to clarify past misunderstandings. Madison ignored them all. What she didn't ignore was the subpoena filed by Veronica, the Carter family's current legal counsel and Patricia's longtime confidant. It came swift, veiled as a formal request for clarification, but Madison saw through it. This was the opening shot, a warning. She brought the letter to Raymond, who scanned it with a calm she both envied and depended on. "They're rattled," he said simply, "which means it's working." He handed her a folder. Inside, the original deed to Eleanor's private townhouse in Montpelier, a key, and a sealed envelope in her mother's handwriting. Madison's hands trembled as she opened it. "Madison, if you're reading this, then Patricia didn't succeed in burning everything. I was always afraid I wouldn't have the strength to fight her. Not with Tyler on her side, but I saw you. Even when you thought I didn't, this place was meant for you. Your name is on the title now. I hope you'll go there and find the rest of me I couldn't show you." "Mom." The townhouse hadn't been touched in years. The ivy had grown unchecked, curling around the wrought iron fence like forgotten memories. Madison entered with the key and found the air thick with dust and silence, but it was hers. That was the difference. In the study, tucked behind old poetry books and yellowing medical texts, she found a locked drawer in the writing desk. The key Eleanor had left with the will opened it. Inside, an old camcorder, and 3 tapes labeled in her mother's handwriting, each one dated within the final 2 months of Eleanor's life. Madison carried them like sacred relics back to Zoe's apartment, where they dusted off an old player Raymond had loaned them. The screen crackled, then settled into the dimly lit study of the Carter mansion. Eleanor's face filled the frame, drawn, elegant, eyes heavy with truths not yet spoken. She began to speak. "I know I won't survive them," Eleanor said, voice low but unwavering. "They think the pills are working. They think I'm weaker each day because of the illness. But it's not just that. It's the weight of keeping this secret for so long. Madison is my daughter. Legally, biologically, entirely. And Tyler is not who they believe he is." Zoe gasped beside her, but Madison, she couldn't. Her heart pounded against the shell of her ribs like a caged thing. The video continued. "I was warned. When I tried to change the will, Patricia had the papers intercepted. Tyler, I raised him like my own, but he was not my blood. He is Donald's son, yes, but from another woman. He was brought into this house to fill a void. But Madison, she was always mine." The tape ended in static. Madison leaned forward, elbows on her knees, breath coming shallow. Zoe turned to her. "Are you okay?" "No," Madison whispered, tears trailing slowly down her face. "But I'm not backing down." The next day, she filed a motion to present the tapes in court. The judge set the hearing for 2 weeks later, and on the evening news, the Carter Foundation issued a formal statement. "We are aware of claims regarding Ms. Madison Carter's legal status and inheritance. The Foundation remains committed to transparency and awaits the court's judgment. In the meantime, we ask for privacy." It was too late for privacy now. The war had begun. The courtroom was colder than Madison had imagined, not in temperature, though the air conditioning was relentless, but in the way it stripped everyone of ceremony. No grand chandeliers like the Carter Gala Hall, no velvet-lined chairs, just wood, steel, and silence heavy enough to press against her spine. She sat at the plaintiff's table, flanked by Raymond and a court-appointed officer of inheritance law. On the other side, Patricia sat rigid in tailored black, her lips a single unbroken line. Tyler slouched beside her, the weight of his father's legacy suddenly ill-fitted on his borrowed suit. The judge, a weathered woman in her late 60s with eyes like winter frost, called the court to order. Madison rose when asked, heart knocking steadily behind her ribs. She had spent the past week memorizing every word, rehearsing until her mouth hurt. But now that the moment was here, none of it felt rehearsed. None of it felt distant. "Your Honor," Raymond began, voice calm, respectful, firm, "we present today a motion to validate the supplemental testament of Eleanor Carter, deceased, and to admit 3 visual recordings into evidence that directly dispute the authenticity and intent of the will previously executed under the supervision of Patricia Carter." The judge nodded once. "Proceed." The first tape played on a wide screen mounted at the front. Eleanor's voice, steady but weak, filled the room. As she spoke, the tension rippled like a low tide pulling from every corner of the courtroom. Madison didn't look at the screen. She watched Patricia. The woman did not blink, not even when Eleanor said the words, "Madison is my daughter, my only legal heir, and Patricia knows it." A collective shift moved through the room. Several reporters scribbled furiously into notebooks. One of the junior Carters, seated in the back, rose halfway from his seat and then slumped back down. But it wasn't until the second tape that the mask cracked. In that recording, Eleanor revealed the sealed birth certificate, signed and filed in Montpelier 2 weeks after Madison's birth, bearing her name and that of an anonymous father. She spoke of the fear she had lived with, the manipulation Patricia held over her, and her repeated but failed attempts to revise the will. Then came the name. "I never knew if Donald was the father, but I know it wasn't Patricia's husband. That child was never mine. That's what killed me in the end, raising a lie, living one." Patricia's knuckles whitened around her leather folder. When the second tape ended, the room held its breath. The judge called for recess. In the hallway, Madison leaned against the wall, eyes closed. Her body felt heavy, like it had borrowed all its strength from borrowed anger. Zoe appeared beside her, handing her a bottle of water. She knew everything, didn't she? And still she stayed. She was protecting me, Madison whispered. Or maybe herself. I can't tell anymore. They sat in the corridor for a long minute. Then the door opened again. From within the courtroom, Veronica stepped out, her heels clicking sharply, her face unreadable. She walked straight to Madison, her voice low enough not to draw attention. You don't know what you've started. Madison stared back, refusing to flinch. I didn't start this. It all ended. And with that, she turned and re-entered the courtroom just as the final tape was being cued. This one bore no label, only a timestamp, 1 week before Eleanor's death. The screen lit up again, and this time someone else's voice answered Eleanor's. Mailer Tyler. We had a deal. You promised you'd leave it alone. I changed my mind. She deserves to know. If you release that will, Patricia will bury you. Then she'll have to bury the truth too. The screen went black and the room erupted. The judge called for order, but the courtroom had already fractured. The revelation of Tyler's voice, the threat, the implicit conspiracy, had shattered whatever neutral ground remained. Reporters stood in a flurry, some racing toward the exit to file the story. Patricia's expression remained rigid, but her fingers betrayed her, tapping nervously, unconsciously, against the polished mahogany of the table. Raymond rose again. Your Honor, we request a forensic review of the final testament dated May 3rd. The newly revealed audio indicates the deceased may have been coerced or prevented from amending her will. We also request immediate access to the Montpelier archives, where the birth certificate and notarized medical records are located. The judge, now paler than before, glanced at the screen as if the silence in the room were louder than anything spoken. You will have it, she said. This court will reconvene in 72 hours. Until then, all assets remain frozen. This includes Carter estate accounts, trusts, and real property. A murmur spread. Madison sat still, eyes fixed on Patricia, who finally turned to look at her. It wasn't hate. It wasn't even fear. It was contempt rooted in disbelief, like a monarch watching a usurper drag mud through the throne room. And yet, Patricia didn't speak a word. Outside the courthouse, the Vermont sky was leaden, threatening a storm. Journalists crowded near the steps, microphones like weapons pointed toward Madison, toward Raymond, toward anyone who looked like they had a piece of the truth. Zoe blocked most of them, shielding Madison with her small frame and fierce energy. But one voice cut through the crowd. Madison, were you aware that Eleanor tried to contact a second lawyer the week she died? She froze. What second lawyer? She asked, turning. A man stepped forward, gray-haled, holding a yellowed folder. Name's Ellis. I was retained briefly by Mrs. Carter. She left a voicemail for me 2 days before she passed, but I was on a plane to Denver. When I called back, no one answered. Raymond motioned him inside the building immediately. That night, in Zoe's apartment above a coffee shop in Montpelier, Madison sat on the couch with a folder open in her lap. Inside was a handwritten letter. Not notarized, not legally binding, but raw in its emotion. To Madison, I should have told you sooner. I waited too long and now I fear time is closing in on me. Patricia has eyes in every room. Even the doctors are wary of her. I made copies 3, hidden where only you will look if you trust your instincts. You always were sharper than them. I loved you more than I ever admitted aloud. I'm sorry I didn't protect you when you needed me most. Love. E. Madison read it twice, then again, before folding it back gently. She didn't cry. She didn't tremble. She simply stood and walked to the window, looking out at the quiet street below, the bakery signs swaying in the breeze. Patricia would fight harder now. So would Veronica. But the momentum had shifted. The woman they thought they buried beneath a forged will had already planted seeds in places they never searched. Later that night, as she flipped through Eleanor's medical files Ellis had also retrieved, a post-it note slipped free from between the pages. On it was a scribbled address. No context. Zoe leaned over her shoulder. "Do you recognize it?" "No," Madison said softly. "But I will." And in that moment she realized something had changed. She was no longer just reacting to the past, she was chasing it down. The address led to a cabin just outside of Barre, nestled against a stretch of woods where cell service faded, and the only sound was the wind threading through the trees. Madison stood at the foot of the gravel path, letter clutched in one hand, Eleanor's handwriting still fresh in her memory. "You'll know it's the right place when the air feels familiar." It did. The trees looked like the ones from her childhood sketches, tall, tight-packed, and silent. There was a time she thought she'd imagine this place. Now it stood in front of her like a piece of her mother's last truth. Zoe parked behind her, engine cutting into the quiet. "Are you sure about this?" "No," Madison said, "but I have to be." Inside the cabin was dust and silence. Wooden beams, faded curtains, a cast-iron stove, everything preserved like a forgotten museum. On a table near the back wall lay 3 manila envelopes, labeled in Eleanor's handwriting. Madison reached for them with a shaking hand. The first contained a full genetic report, DNA comparisons, medical records, and a notarized affidavit from a Dr. Richard Boone, dated nearly 15 years ago. It confirmed what the tapes had hinted. Patricia had altered Madison's medical records to obscure her parentage, filing false immunization documents under a proxy name. The second envelope held photographs, old ones. Eleanor and Madison on the beach in Cape Cod. A man with his back to the camera, tall, dark hair, arms around Eleanor. Scribbled on the back of one was the name Caleb, the man Madison never knew, the man Eleanor never named. The third was a USB drive. Madison plugged it into Zoe's laptop, waiting as the screen flickered to life. The video began abruptly, Eleanor sitting at the same cabin table, face weary but composed. "If you're watching this, Maddie, then Patricia didn't succeed. Or at least not fully. I knew I was running out of time, knew Tyler was already involved, and I knew you'd come back, not to avenge me, but to reclaim yourself." Eleanor exhaled, clasped together tightly. "You were never weak. They made you think that so you'd stop looking, but the truth is everything they built, every dollar, every connection relied on one lie. That you didn't matter, that you didn't belong. You do. You always did." Madison leaned forward, her throat tight. Eleanor continued. "There's a clause in the trust, one Patricia thought she buried. It requires the signature of the biological heir to authorize liquidation of the Vermont properties. Without it, every transaction she's ever made in your name is void. Raymond knows where to look now. You just have to let him in." The screen went black. Zoe whispered, "This changes everything." Madison closed the laptop. "No, this ends it." The next day they met Raymond at the Carter Law Group downtown office. With the contents of the cabin in hand and Ellis's testimony secured, Raymond filed a motion to suspend Patricia's power of attorney retroactively. That same morning, the Montpelier courthouse received an anonymous envelope, inside a copy of Patricia's private emails with a finance broker in Zurich. "I didn't send that," Madison said quietly. Raymond smiled faintly. "Maybe you weren't the only one she underestimated." By midday, the judge reconvened an emergency session. Patricia, for the first time, looked rattled. Her foundation was uneven, her earrings mismatched. Tyler sat beside her, jaw clenched, one eye swollen from what he claimed was a fall down the stairs. Madison didn't ask. She took her seat. When the judge entered and the gavel struck, the room shifted again, like air pulled tight before the first crack of thunder. This time, the truth wasn't just knocking, it was breaking the door down. The courtroom was tense, every breath held as Madison rose to speak. She looked out at the faces of Patricia as sharp glare, Tyler's forced composure, Raymond's steady encouragement, and found a quiet strength that had been building inside her for years. "I stand here not just as a daughter, but as the rightful heir to the Carter estate," Madison began, her voice calm but resolute. "For decades I was kept in the shadows, told I was less than, but the truth cannot be buried forever." She laid out the evidence, the forged documents, the altered medical records, the taped confession from her mother. Each piece struck like a hammer against the facade Patricia had built. The judge listened intently, flipping through the files, nodding at points where law and fact intersected with undeniable clarity. When Madison finished, the silence in the room was deafening. Patricia's defense stumbled. She tried to deny, to deflect, but the weight of proof was insurmountable. Even Tyler's smooth assurances couldn't mask the growing cracks in their alliance. Outside the courtroom, reporters jostled for space, eager to capture every moment of the unfolding drama. The story of the forgotten daughter reclaiming her birthright captured hearts across Vermont and beyond. Messages of support flooded Madison's phone. Tenants, friends, even strangers who saw in her struggle a reflection of their own battles. But for Madison, this wasn't just about money or property. It was about justice. Days later, the judge delivered the verdict. Patricia's power of attorney was revoked. The forged will was declared null and void. The trust terms were reinstated, recognizing Madison as the sole beneficiary. Tyler faced charges for his role in the harassment and fraud schemes, and Raymond was appointed executor to oversee the estate's fair management. Madison felt a rush of relief and exhaustion, a mix she hadn't known she could carry all at once. Returning to the now unlocked family home, she walked through rooms heavy with memory. The weight of past betrayals still lingered, but the air felt lighter. She stopped by her mother's old piano, fingers brushing the keys softly. A message from Zoe buzzed on her phone. "Dinner this weekend? My treat, let's celebrate the new chapter." Madison smiled, typing back, "Wouldn't miss it for the world." That night, as she lay in bed, the house quiet except for the distant hum of the city, Madison allowed herself a moment to breathe. She was no longer the girl who had to prove her worth in silence. She was whole, free, and finally home. Thank you, and closing statement. Thank you so much for joining us on this powerful journey through Madison's story, a tale of resilience, truth, and reclaiming what's rightfully hers. We hope her courage and determination inspire you to face your own challenges with strength and hope. Family can be complicated, and sometimes the hardest battles are fought with those closest to us. But remember, no matter what, your worth is never defined by others' opinions or actions. Like Madison, you have the power to rewrite your story and find peace on your own terms. If this story touched you, please consider liking, sharing, and subscribing. Your support helps us bring more real, meaningful stories to light. Stories that remind us all of the power of truth, justice, and self-love. Thank you again for watching. Stay strong, stay hopeful, and we'll see you in the next video.